Welcome, everyone. It's so nice to see you all. You who I haven't met yet, my name is Jordana Amzel, and I'm going to be helping out behind the scenes or in front of the scene on Zoom with a few things. And I wanted to share a few things you need to know before Dani Segal starts to teach. First, just a warm welcome to the Temple Emmanuel community. We're so excited to continue to learn with you throughout our All Together Now programming, which is a month-long celebration of ideas. For those of you who haven't joined us yet, this is our third of 4 sessions with Hartman faculty that we are doing with Temple Emmanuel. And these are scheduled on Tuesdays at 10 a.m. Our last session as a part of this series is next Tuesday with Yehuda Kurtzer. And I want to give a warm welcome to my colleague Talia Graff, who joined us on the call today, who works on our Boston programming, as well as to Ariel Meiri, who many of you have met over the last few weeks, who's also helping out behind the scenes and making all these sessions possible. Very special thank you to Temple Emmanuel for being a presenting sponsor of our summer program. We are so grateful for your support that is making this free programming available for thousands of people across North America and also in Israel. So we would like to ask you to update your name on your Zoom display. That's your little box with your face in it. It also has your name on it. So if it doesn't say your name, if it says like iPad or something else that's not your name, if you can click the 3 dots on the top right corner, you can rename yourself with your correct name. We'd love to know who's here. And this is a Zoom meeting where all participants will be muted until the question and answer. Dani will be taking questions both in the middle of the session and towards the end. And you can either use the hand raise function, which is on the bottom right of your screen on the participant tab, or you can send a chat to either me or Ariel, and we will make sure that you get to ask your question. And it'll be calling on you, and then we'll be unmuting you so that you can speak. This session will also be recorded, and you should be able to find the recording of the class on the session page by the end of the week. If you have any trouble accessing the recording, feel free to let me know, and I'll also be sending out the recording next week as well. Dani will be showing the sources for this class during the presentation, and they are also available in the link in the chat that I just sent. So without further ado, to introduce Dani, he attended Har Etzion Hesder Yeshiva, and he served as a paratrooper in the IDF. Rabbi Segal is a founding member of Beit Prat, Israeli Midrasha, Israel's leading pluralistic Beit Midrash for young adults, with several thousand alumni and some 300 new students each year. Beit Prat strengthens the pluralistic Jewish character of Israel, nurtures connections between Israelis of different backgrounds, and builds a bridge between Israeli young adults and their diaspora peers. He was also the rabbi in Alon, a pluralistic community, for over 8 years. So a warm welcome to Dani, and that's it. Let's get started and enjoy the learning.
Shalom to everyone. I'm spotlighted, so I don't see all the faces. It was so much fun seeing everybody's living rooms or kitchens. It's mamash a pleasure to see you, and a lot of familiar faces in the crowd, and I've had the privilege over the past few years to meet many of you at Hartman and also at Beit Prat events. So mamash tada. I also owe all of you a personal thanks because I was so nervous about speaking in English for over an hour. I called my Abba and I went over the whole class with him. So I had a lot of quality time with my father, thanks to you. So toda rabba. We'll be learning for about an hour, and then we'll open for questions. I'll pause for questions in the middle for 2 reasons. One, it'll give a chance to ask questions, and it'll give me a chance to think of the next English words that I need to think of for the second part. So whenever you have a question, just keep in mind that you're helping me out. So I'm very happy for questions. Before I go to the sources, I want to start with Anna was at Temple Emmanuel, right, with Rani and Orit. when we could still travel, when there were planes in the air and we could meet each other in person. Nachon. We had a wonderful time at Temple Emmanuel. It's toda rabba. And I also saw Rabbi Wes. So shalom, and good to be here. I have one word in Hebrew that came to mind, and then I'll start with two words in English. The word in Hebrew that I was thinking of was the word tamid. Tamid, I think in Hebrew, in English, would translate as always. The word tamid appears 35 times in the Torah. I spent most of the preparation for this class just counting. So 35 times in the Torah it says tamid. 34 out of those 35, by the way, have to do with the Mishkan, with the tabernacle. And number 35 is something different. But the word tamid translates in English, I would say the two different words. Tamid can be always. Nachmanides, the Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachmanides says that the word tamid appears with the Mishkan all the time, with the tabernacle, because that's the idea of the Mishkan. According to his interpretation, the Mishkan is supposed to take, am I using the right word, tabernacle? Is that the Mishkan? Somebody say yes? Yeah, Jordana, thank you. So the tabernacle is supposed to take Har Sinai and allow us to travel with it for the rest of the desert. So if there was a big fire and flame on Har Sinai, there's a small flame in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle. And if God spoke to us on Mount Sinai, so he'll keep speaking to us within the Mishkan. And then the word tamid, Nachmanides says, is basically making something that only happened once last forever. So that's the whole idea of the Mishkan, and that's where the word tamid comes from. But tamid doesn't only mean always. It also means regularly. In Hebrew, there is a word hatmada. Like if I have cornflakes every morning, I can say, Ani tamid ochel cornflakes. Cornflakes is a Hebrew word. Ani tamid ochel cornflakes would say, I have cornflakes every morning. Not that I'm always eating cornflakes. That's not what the word tamid means. It's regularly. That's what I do every morning. And what's nice about the Hebrew is it collapses both those meanings together, saying that maybe what happens tamid has a sense, or is it if it happens tamid. Like whatever I do regularly has a sense of always. So Ner tamid, for instance, the eternal fire in the Mishkan, tamid there translates into always, because it was always lit. But Korban Tamid, the sacrifice, is not, it wasn't always sacrifice. It's not an eternal sacrifice, but every morning and every late afternoon, there was a sacrifice called Korban Tamid, because it happened every day. And it doesn't always only appear 17 times in our parasha. The word Tamid also appeared last Thursday. Last Thursday was the 17th of Tammuz, a fast day. One of two fast days, the 17th of Tammuz and Tisha B'Av coming up in 2 weeks and a bit, both concerned with the destruction of the first and second temple. One of the things that happened on the 17th of Tammuz, according to the Mishnah, is the Mishnah uses the words Batala Tamid. That's when the Tamid was canceled. Because for years and years, even though there were wars going on, mostly between Jews that thought differently, and these Jews were friends of the Greeks, and these Jews weren't, and there was a war going on, but even though the war was going on, and Jerusalem was in siege, every day the people outside the walls would take two sheep, bring them over the wall so they could keep sacrificing the Tamid. And on the 17th of Tammuz, they said, the hell with it, we're stopping. And that's when the Tamid was canceled. Some of us might be familiar that another thing that happened on the 17th of Tammuz, what we might have been taught, is that the walls of the city were broken. And then 3 weeks later, the temple was destroyed. Those two things also can collapse together. Because basically, I think what we do always, our tamid, are always our regular things, those create a wall around us. What we're used to, the cornflakes we eat every morning, or the people we meet, or the shul we go to, or our work, or the people we talk to, or the family surrounding us, all the tmidim in our life, everything that's always there, that creates a wall that protects us. And it's very nice that the Mishnah says that two things happened on Yud Zayin B'Tammuz. It's 2 out of 5. But Batala Tamid and Nifretzu HaChomot, which means the Tamid was canceled and the walls were broken into, those are basically, I think, saying the same thing. Or saying that the walls we build around ourselves in our life have a lot to do with what we always do. Now that term, Batala Tamid, has been very meaningful for me in the past few weeks and months. Because for many of us, our Tamid is not as it always has been. And that term, Batala Tamid, is something that I want to put that on the table for a second, because it's one of the things I want to talk about. So that's the Hebrew word I'm going to mention, Batala Tamid. I also want to relate to two words in English, and then I'll pause for a second in case there was a misunderstanding, and then we'll go into the sources. I'm going to share a beautiful poem. It's the first source on the page. I'm going to share it here. I hope you can all see. And if you've printed out the sources, so it's source number 1. And it's a poem written by Leah Goldberg. I'll say one word about Leah Goldberg. It's called Oranim in Hebrew, or Pines in English. Leah Goldberg, I think she should have been our national poet. Bialik is always referred to as our national poet, but if we can choose two, I choose Leah Goldberg. Because the national poet is not just an amazing poet, which she was, but we had some other amazing poets. We had Dalia Rabikovich, and we had Nathan Alterman, and we had many others. And Zelda, but like Bialik, I think, was chosen to be our national poet because not only does he write beautifully, but everything that happened to the nation happened to him. So he left the yeshivot, and he joined the secular world, and he left Europe, and he came to Israel, and he had an ongoing conversation between tradition and modernity. Everything that happened to the people of Israel while Bialik was living happened to Bialik. So he's not only an amazing poet, he's going through everything that went through the nation. Leah Goldberg, in a very similar way, she comes here with the first Aliyot, and she leaves Russia, along with 3 million other Jews that are migrating. And most of those 3 million arrive in Boston or in Philadelphia or New York, and 30,000 of them, 1%, arrive in Israel. And she's amongst the 1%. And she's here in Israel, and she writes beautiful poetry in Hebrew, and it's not her mother tongue. And that's also amazing about a poet, to become such a successful poet in a language you didn't even grow up in. And in this poem called Oranim, she writes about belonging to two different landscapes. So I'll read her one or two in Hebrew and in English. She writes, כאן לא אשמע את כל הקוקייה, כאן לא יחבוש העץ מצנפת שלג, אבל בצל האורנים האלה, כל ילדותי שקמה לתחייה. I'll read it in English. Here I will not hear the cuckoo's voice. Here the tree will not don a turban of snow, but in the shade of these pines, my entire childhood comes back to life. So she's growing up in a place where she doesn't really belong. And she's looking at the pine trees in Israel, which remind her of the pine trees where she grew up, but there's never going to be snow on the top of the pine trees here in Israel. So it brings back memories, but it's so different at the same time. And one of the nice things about this poem is there was a tune put to it, and the tune put to it was by an Israeli singer called Achinoam Nini. Maybe some of you know her by the name of Noah. She was born in Israel. She grew up in New Jersey, and she came back, and her career is between Israel and America. And when she writes a tune to this beautiful poem, she adds a third verse in English, the one here. And after singing two verses in Hebrew, she goes to, I remember those snow-capped mountains, and a song on an FM 93. Oh, my darling, now I have grown with you, but my roots on both sides of the sea. Now, if you listen to this, I'll send a link later. It's beautiful because the melody also changes. She goes from what can remind us of Russia or the first Aliyot, and then it's like this Western, like you can hear her singing an American folk song when she's singing, I remember those snow-capped mountains. Then she'll go back to the tune and to the words, and she's doing the same play the second time on what Leah Goldberg was writing. She's also saying, I grew up on both sides of the sea, and I feel at home here and I feel at home there. So when we pause for questions, maybe I didn't think of finding the song in advance, and we can listen towards the end. It's beautiful. So that's homework for everybody if we don't get to do it during the class. I want to start with this, and the two words in English I wanted to mention are the word roots, my roots on both sides of the sea. And there was a book written that I'm sure many of you are familiar with by James Clifford called Roots. It's another beautiful word play because the book is R-O-U-T-E-S. And he speaks about the ability of roots, spelled with a O-U, to be our roots. And how in modern times, something in translation, I don't remember the subtitle of the book, but that our traveling and the places that we visit can be our new roots. And she does, Leah Goldberg has the same wordplay in Hebrew on the word nofim. Nof, that here is translated as landscape. So nof is also the top of the tree, and it's also landscape. So she's also playing between what's rooted in the ground and what is out there with the word nof, and the same wordplay goes in English. I wanted to use those three words, the word tamid and the roots, spelled with two O's, and the roots of R-O-U-T-E-S, to frame a bit of what I want to talk about, because this was titled about community. Is it a sanctuary of renewal or a space of limitation? And I want to look at places that we're rooted in, or places that are a safe haven for us. I'm going to look at three, at our personal homes, at a sense of belonging at home. I want to focus on community. That's going to be the main Talmudic passage that we'll study together. I want to look later on at a national level, and to take those three levels, and in each one of them, try and look at if they're really a safe haven or a sanctuary or a place for renewal, or in what ways do they limit us or not enable us to grow. So that's basically the framing that I want to give for this session. I'm going to stop sharing just for 1 second before I go to the first source. I want to make sure that I didn't say anything that was not understood, and the people who are out there are saying, what is this person talking about? If we're fine, yeah, okay. And if there's anything, you can write it in the chat, and if Jordana sees and it's important enough, or if anything wasn't understood or basic misunderstanding, so she'll call my attention, and I'll continue with the sources now. Sada? So the three circles that I want to look at, as I said, were home and community and a national level of feeling or not feeling at home. And I'm going to start with a short story brought in Genesis Rabbah, a story that I like very much. I'll just move this for a second. Okay. Genesis Rabbah is an early midrash. Midrash is an interpretation on the verses. This is 5th or 6th century in Israel. And it tells a story of a teacher and a student, which I find very touching. So a disciple of Rav Isi, or Rabbi Yossi, was sitting before him and could not comprehend what he was explaining to him. Anybody who's been a teacher, and you're teaching in a class of 20 or 30 people, and you see that one of the students, he just doesn't get it. And nothing that you're saying is entering, or he's not understanding. Rabbi Yossi was nice enough, and I hope he said this in a nice tone and manner. He walks up to the student and he says, why cannot you grasp it? Like, what's wrong? Why aren't you, he might have been screaming at him. I hope he wasn't. He might have been pulling his ear. Or he might have just walked over and put a gentle hand on his shoulder and asked, hey, I see that you're not understanding anything. What's wrong? He replied, because I'm in exile from home. I'm far away from home. My Ima and Abba aren't here. I haven't had a hot meal in a while. So Rabbi Yossi asks, where are you from? And he says, from Gabot Shammai. I'll stop here for a second because Gabot Shammai, if you look in the maps, is nowhere. It doesn't appear. There's no such place as Gabot Shammai, and it's not mentioned as a place anywhere else in the sources. And if you listen to the Hebrew, it has Gav, which is like a back, and Shammai can either say Sham, which is there, like it's there, and Shammai is the one who wasn't accepted. Maybe it's Hillel and Shammai. So I come from a place where everybody has turned their back to, or I come from a place which is Shammai. He's the one that was thrown out of the Bet Midrash, or the tradition that we don't live according to. Or Sham can be the ultimate there, like the Mount Everest, which is the ultimate ever, 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 ever. It's so tall. So Shammai is Sham, 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 right? It's there. I think there's a word in Yiddish, right? Isn't there a city, Amy, you know the name. Unmute yourself.
Jenemsveld, nowhere.
Lachon. I knew there was a word in Yiddish. So Gabot Shammai is Jenemsveld. I hope I pronounced that correctly. So that's what he says. That's Gabot Shammai. And Rabbi Yossi asks him, so say something about Gabot Shammai. What is its climate? Climate in the Hebrew doesn't really use climate. It says, like, what happens there? Ma viro shel oto makom. Like what? Say something about Gabot Shammai. So the student says, oh, when a child is born there, we have to crush spices and smear his head with it, lest insects should eat him. Which makes us really want to travel to Gabot Shammai. That's a nice place to go. Why Florida? Let's go to Gabot Shammai. So, and then Rabbi Yossi says, blessed is he who inspireth the inhabitants of a place with love for it. The Hebrew is Baruch Shenatan Chen Makom B'nei Yoshvav. If you look at the bottom of the page, the next source is basically saying, it's nice that somebody likes Gabot Shammai, or how lucky it is that the Lord was smart enough, that Hashem was smart enough to make every person love the place where they live. Okay, so if people ask you what's the nicest place in the world, you're probably saying Newton, Massachusetts. Jordana, I don't know what you would say, Yerushalayim or somewhere else, but we grow to love the place where we live. In the source, in the next source, I'll just give a short look. So the Talmud will say in Tractate Sotah that people, there's a story there about Elisha, the prophet that came in place of Elijah, and he approaches a city and he asks them, hey, how is this city? And they say, it's a wonderful city, but the water is terrible and you can't drink it, and the land miscarries and people die here all the time. So the Talmud asks, what's so good about the city if you can't drink the water and you can't grow anything from the land? And then they say, it's just, that's the way it is. People like where they live. People like the person they choose to live with. People like the things they acquired and they bought in life. That's one of the, we can say it's a cognitive dissonance. Or we can say that just people grow to love where they are. But I want to look at this story for a second. By the way, I didn't bring it because it's all in Hebrew, but there was a child's, he was many things, a person named Duri Orbach. He was also a member of Knesset. By the way, he was very devoted to Jewish pluralism. And, and he, before he became a member of Knesset, had a radio show with Sheli Yachimovic. They were two opposite sides of the political map. And he was also very identified with religious Zionists, and she was very identified with the left and with the secular. And they had a beautiful radio show together, trying to speak about what we have in common. And from there, they both went to politics, which is also interesting, to opposite parties, but they remained very good friends. And after he was in Knesset, he also wrote books for children. He turned this little story into a bedtime story. And he has this whole thing about Rabbi Yossi approaching this student, and the student saying that everybody's making fun of him because he lives in Gabot Shammai, and how he misses home because it might be a terrible place, but people are nice to each other, and how it's terrible to be here in the cold and miserable Bet Midrash. And it's a beautiful story, and there Rabbi Yossi hugs him and he becomes the best student. But what I want to think about for a second is, do we need to feel at home or do we not need to feel at home? This student can't learn anything because the way he puts it, he's in exile from home. And he's unable to study new text because he just doesn't feel at home. And when you're not comfortable, you can't learn anything new. I'll stop sharing for faces for a second. And I know many of you are familiar with Micha Goodman, because I know he comes to your community a lot, and many of you know him from Hartman and from Bet Prat, and he's also a scholar that many people just know. And at Bet Prat, I have, me and Micha have a famous dispute, and we have it again and again every time new students arrive. I think we should be nice to the new students, and Micha says we shouldn't. I'll try and rephrase it to make Micha look a bit better, because that wasn't fair to present it that way. But when everybody arrives, they arrive at 10 o'clock in the morning. And Micha's idea is we don't give them rooms. It's a sleepover program. They're going to be here for a month or for 4 months. So everybody comes with their big bag, and they're not admitted to their rooms till late afternoon. And their bags are lying out there in the sun. And they come into their first class, and they have nowhere where they feel at home. And Micha believes, and now I'll say something for the sake of his argument, that the moment you have a place where you can rest, your heart is not open to hear anything new. He says it closes your walls. If you're comfortable, then your instincts aren't out there listening and thinking and learning new things. So when I say, hey, they've just arrived, let's make them feel at home. Let's give them a bed and a place and a closet where they can put their clothes, and we'll meet them again in half an hour. This is what the disciple is saying to Rabbi Yossi, I can't learn, I'm not at home. But the opposite saying, which we'll find later on, there's a term in Hebrew that says, Heve golel imkom Torah. If you want to learn Torah, you have to be in exile. So Heve golel imkom Torah, across the generations, was because we didn't have many great yeshivas. So if you wanted to study, you needed to leave home because you wanted to go. If you became a better student, you go to the yeshiva. But Hevei Golel Imkom Torah, Micha turned it into an ideal. If you're not in exile, you're never going to learn anything. So I want you to be shaken or jolted or something that will allow you to be open to new truths, to something that you want to learn. So those are the two first things that I want to put out, thinking about home. and thinking about a sense of home or being at home. And this is still all on the personal level. I haven't talked about community or the national level yet. Just where do we grow, or how can we grow? In our safe spot when we feel very much at home? Or is our ability to grow dependent on many ways on the fact that somebody took our safe spot away and that our bags are lying out in the sun and we have no idea who we're going to be in the room with and what they're going to serve for lunch and who are these people? Are we then more open to study or to learn new things? So I'm going to pause here for a second. Just before I go into the community level, because in the community, I want to jump into Talmud. And I know you have a weekly class. And so just before we go deep into a Talmudic sugya, I want to stop here for a second. And I'll look at the chat for a second. And I think we're small enough. If you want to just raise your hand. And if I don't see, if Jordana, if you see something, or Amy, if you spot someone, and you're very welcome to just react out in loud or ask a question before we move on to the Talmud.
Feel free to unmute yourself, or you can send the chat. If you have a comment, we're happy to.
Thank you, Susan, for your comment. And yeah, it's something I think a lot about. If we need to change our career radically, or if we need to change homes, or anything that gives us a sense of belonging, and what does that do to us to stay open to that? Any other remarks or thoughts at this stage? So I'm going to move on to community, but please feel free at any point. And again, Jordan, if I missed something, if you can call my attention. So thank you. I want to look again. I want to look now at the community level, because in terms of feeling at home, that has a lot to do with just us as personal people. And you know what? We might grow. We might have different answers to the question we just posed. It's not is the Michai way of doing things right, or the Dani way, or another way, because I think some of us grow when we're at home, and some of us grow when we're not. I like to plan my shiurim very well, and I feel very unsafe if I enter a class if I haven't gone over all the sources, and even if I don't really know what I want to say about each one of them. On the other hand, my best shiur this year, which I enjoyed most, was a shiur in Daf Yomi, teaching a different page of Talmud every time. And what I enjoyed so much is that I wasn't prepared, and I didn't always have time to prepare. And when people ask you in the middle of the class, hey, what does this mean? And you have no idea, those are some of the best moments. And that's when you really grow. So I don't want to say that one answer is correct, but I just want to say that they're both there. That being at home can help us grow, but that sometimes the only way is if somebody will push us out of our safe zone. So now we're going to learn anybody who's doing Daf Yomi and who's following the pace of doing one page of Talmud a day. So we're almost at 130 in the middle of Tractate Shabbat, which we've been spending the past few months with, the past 4 months. And we're about to approach, can you all hear me? Because yeah. We're about to approach this, this passage in Masechet Shabbat. It's on page 147, so we'll be there in about 2 weeks. And Tractate Shabbat is about things we can do or can't do on Shabbat. A lot of it is about moving from place to place, and then all the things that many of us might have learned growing up. Can you light a fire? Can you fix something? Can you write? Can you build? Different things we're allowed to do or not allowed to do on Shabbat. This specific Mishnah, the specific passage that we're going to be studying, has specifically to do with something on Shabbat called sochet. Sochet is I'm trying to drain something from its, like if there's a wet shirt and you squinch it,
You wring it out.
wring it out. I knew there was a better word than squinch. So you're not allowed to wring things out on Shabbat, or you can't squeeze things. Like you can't make orange juice on Shabbat according to the Mishnah. You can't squeeze oranges, or you can't squeeze a wet shirt, or some will say you can't squeeze your hair if there's a lot of water and you've just come out of the shower. There's a lot about wringing out on Shabbat. So I'll just say we're going to learn a Mishnah which says a halacha, a ruling from halacha, and then we're going to learn a story. I'm sure you've done this many times in your Talmud classes. Some call this nomus, a narrative, or halacha and agada. Many times the Talmud, and it's what's so beautiful about it, will play between giving a halachic ruling, this is what you can do and you can't do, and then the Talmud will go on to tell a story. And many times there's an interesting relationship between the halachic ruling that the Mishnah said and between the story that will appear later. So we're going to start with the halachic ruling, and then we'll go to the story. And I'm just reminding us, what I want to look at now is not a sense of home of an individual, but what does belonging to a group or a community mean in terms of our ability to renew ourselves or to learn new things, or where can it be a limiting power? Okay, so the Mishnah will say the following, and it's kind of an icky Mishnah, so I apologize in advance. Okay, if one bathes in the water of a pit, or in the water of Tiberias, the Kinneret, and dries himself, even with 10 towels, he must not fetch them in his hand. Okay, so you're in Tiberias for Shabbat, you went to the Kinneret, you're very, very strict about drying yourself when you get out of the water, so you took 10 towels, and you used one after the other. The 10th towel, by the way, is probably pretty dry. Still, the Mishnah says, we don't want you to pick up that towel because it might be a little wet, and we're afraid you're going to wring it out. But on the contrary, 10 people may dry their faces, hands, and feet on one towel. Sorry, those of you who are making a face, that means you understood the Mishnah. Okay, now we're 10 people. We all went to the Kinneret together. But when we got out of the water, we start looking at each other. Hey, who brought a towel? Did you bring a towel? No, I didn't bring a towel. Did you bring a towel? And then 10 wet people are standing outside and they realize they only have one towel. So they all use that same towel for their faces, their hands, and their feet. You can imagine what that towel looks like and what it feels like after 10 people. Yet the Mishnah will say there's no problem to carry that towel back to the hotel. Now this is interesting. One person with 10 towels, you can't even carry the 10th towel. And 10 people with one towel, they're allowed to bring that towel back. Any ideas? You can write them in the chat if you want. Any ideas of the difference between the halachic ruling? Why can we not carry the 10th towel? But if there were 10 people using one towel, there's no problem in carrying it. Any thoughts? Okay. Shared responsibility, which would mean if 10 people carry the one towel, so what would that shared responsibility do? Would it say, okay, even if we wring it out, nobody's going to punish us because we can point fingers at each other? Or Rashi will say, shared responsibility is, if I'm about to wring it out, somebody's going to say, hey, don't do that, we'll stone you. Which is not a pleasant thing. So if we're 10 people, maybe the shared responsibility will help us not sin. Any other thoughts? Thank you. Oh, Ariel, you wrote that privately. So that you could have written it for everybody.
If you can Dani, if you can just share, if you're responding to a comment, if you could just share what the comment was, because not everyone can see it.
Okay, so I'll say it out loud because Ariel was polite enough to write it privately. I'm sorry I'm doing this outing for you, but Ariel wrote the ick factor. I wouldn't touch it. Like if there's a towel that 10 people used, nobody's going to squeeze that towel. Forget stoning. It's just something that we're not going to do. Nachon? So, so we either have the shared responsibility and you have to squeeze 10 together. Nachon, 10 people can do it together. So Rashi and other commentators will say, and I'll go back to the source sheet in a second, Rashi and other commentators will say that the fact that we're here together will help us not sin. We'll remind each other. Somebody won't want to sin when other people are watching. Now that creates, I just want to say that that's very interesting in terms of halakha, because we usually don't have a different halachic ruling that will say, okay, if you're around other people, you can do this, but if you're on your own, you can't. I don't know if you can think of halachot or different rulings that change just because the fact that you're not on your own. Nobody will say, okay, you can't steal if you're on your own, you can steal if there's other people around, or commit different crimes. So it's interesting in itself. And I'm going to leave it at this for a moment, that there's an interesting halakha that if we're amongst other people, then we can do something, but if we're not, we can't. Maybe just to put on the table a thought about our topic, many people will say that community is something that keeps you in place, that we're better people if we're amongst other people. So community is our kehillah, is something that makes us a better person just because it helps us keep our manners and it keeps us in place. And there's things that we wouldn't do if we were around people that knew us. So when I landed once in Las Vegas, so you just get off the plane and there's this big sign, Nachon? What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. And somebody is saying to you, every time rabbis come for RTS or RLI, there's a big sign at Hartman. What happens at Hartman stays at Hartman. Nachon? Nobody knows you here. You can do whatever you want, because they realize that part of what keeps us as good people is the people around us. So maybe this Mishnah is not only they'll remind us that the fact that these 10 people are around us, it's not they'll say, hey, don't squeeze the towel. It's saying if you're amongst people, we're not so worried that you'll do something which is out of place, because the situation just makes you better in that sense. I'm moving on to the story. The Talmud will now go on to speak about water and swimming in water and different things. And relating to water and other things, they'll tell a story about something that happened and had to do with water. And the story is about Rabbi Elazar ben Arach. Before we read the story, I'll just share one word about Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, because for me, he was a childhood hero. Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, if you skip to source number 5, he was one of the 5 disciples of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, I'm sure many of us are familiar with. One of our greatest rabbis, the one who helped us make the transition between a world with a temple and a world without a temple, a student of Hillel and Shammai, and he spoke about his 5 disciples. And they're here. I'm trying to, from here you can see Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkenus, Rabbi Yoshua ben Hanania, Rabbi Yosei the priest, Rabbi Shimon ben Netanel, and Rabbi Elazar ben Arach. He had 5 disciples, and he goes on to say wonderful things about him. And he'll later say that Rabbi Elazar ben Arach was the greatest of all. That if you put all of the sages of Israel on one hand of the scale, or the balance, and Rabbi Elazar ben Arach was on the other, he would win. When I was a child, I always imagined him like Popeye, like, I don't know, this great, strong person, smarter than all the other sages. The interesting thing about him, by the way, is he disappears. 4 out of the 5 will appear in the Talmud many and many times, and will have a lot of quotes. And they'll become major holders of ideas and opinions throughout the Babylonian and Jerusalemite Talmud. Rabbi Elazar ben Arach disappears. He was the greatest student of them all, but we hear almost nothing about him. So many stories are what happened to the passage in Shabbat is about what happened to Rabbi Elazar ben Arach. Now I can go back to the story. It has to do with water. Can you hear me? Ken? Jordana? Can you hear me now?
Your sound is going in and out a little bit. Let's see how it goes.
Okay.
Have you call in.
But we missed why he was the greatest student, and then he disappeared, and then you froze.
Yeah. Can you repeat that? Yeah. Dani? Okay. We still can't hear you. Okay. We're gonna
Oh, because I don't know what happened.
Dani, we still can't hear you, so I send you the
It should be better now?
now.
Yeah. I tried another network, okay?
Okay,
I
great.
apologize.
Great.
I didn't trust
Thank
this
you.
network because it was so important, so I trusted my phone, and I think when calls come in, that's when you weren't hearing me, so,
Okay.
So Rabbi Elazar ben Arach disappeared. We have many stories in the Talmud trying to ask where he went to, and this story that we're gonna study now is one of the answers, what happened to Rabbi Elazar ben Arach. And it has to do with water, and it has to do with what we're talking about, community, so I'll read through it quickly. Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, I'm over here, visited a place. The place, by the way, is called Chamat Gader. There's hot springs in the north of Israel, near the Kinneret. Rabbi Elazar ben Arach was in Yavne, in the south of Israel, along with all the other sages. And at some point, the Talmud records that he moved north. He went to Chamat Gader, to Tiberias. And he enjoyed the good life, and he never came back. And he doesn't come back to Yavne. And he moved to the north. There's many versions to this story. The Midrash in Leviticus will blame his wife and says that she took him there because she didn't like the fact that he was with his rabbi friends all the time. There's many versions. This version just says that he went there and for some reason he didn't come back. So he was attracted to them. I'm reading up here. Okay, can you see where I'm reading? And in consequence, his learning vanished. So he leaves Yavne and he stays in Chamat Gader for a year or two or a month or two, and he forgets all his Torah. This amazing sage, which was the best of them all, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai liked him the most. And we learn so much from him, he forgets all his Torah. And then he comes back to visit the yeshiva. When he returned, he arose to read in the scroll of Torah. And they want to honor him. The rabbi came back. So they give him an aliyah. And he's supposed to read from the Torah. And there's 3 words there which are very famous because they're the first mitzvah. The words in Hebrew are HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem. This month shall be unto you. It's in Shmot in the book of Exodus, chapter 12. And instead he reads Hacheresh Haya Libam. I should have done this. Can you see the sheet here now? I'm writing HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem. And if you look underneath, I'm writing Hacheresh Haya Libam. Look how the Hebrew is similar. It's almost the same. Yet the words, the interpretation is totally opposite. Because instead of reading something about the new month, he reads something about a deaf heart, about a heart that can't listen anymore. So think of how humiliating this whole situation is. The Rosh Yeshiva, the greatest rabbi of all, went on vacation, okay? So Rabbi West went to Florida. And he was supposed to come back to the congregation and deliver a sermon for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And he decided to stay because there's no snow and it was wonderful. And he comes back 2 years later. And because you love him so much, he comes up to give a sermon and he can't pronounce the words. He can't even say one verse or one pasuk correctly. And I think there's silence in the Bet Midrash. And everybody's moving uneasily in their seats. And nobody knows what to do with Rabbi Elazar ben Arach. The story, by the way, continues that they took mercy over him and they had compassion and they prayed for him and he remembered anew all the Torah that he had forgotten. Okay? And then because he became a new person, he changed his name from Rabbi Elazar to Rabbi Nehorai, and that's already okay because Rabbi Nehorai we find a few times in the Talmud. So now we know where Rabbi Elazar ben Arach disappeared. We have a whole story how he forgot everything and how he remembered everything and he changed his name, so everything is okay. But I want to go back to our topic. Our topic was our safe places, our home, our community, our friends around us. And are they good for us or bad for us? Do they allow us to learn are they a sanctuary for renewal or do they not let us grow? Now, in many ways, the Talmud we just read, the Mishnah, the halachic paragraph, and the story are saying exactly the same. What are they saying? You should always remain with your friends, okay, with a little help from my friends. I get by with a little help from my friends. The Beatles song was taken from this passage in the Talmud. Is that a Beatles? I think it is. So what are they basically saying? If you're around your friends, you're okay. So if you're around your friends, you're not going to wring out the towel. If you're around your friends, you're not going to forget your Torah. Basically, the story that the Talmud is saying is just emphasizing in a different way the ruling, the halachic ruling that the Mishnah gave. But I want to give a different interpretation of a very interesting woman. Her name is Emuna Elon, and she wrote a passage a few years ago for Rosh Hashanah, interpreting this story in a very different way that I think is really genius. Emuna Elon comes from a very famous family of a chief justice, of a member of Knesset, of a family who did a lot for Jewish learning here in Israel. And on her own right, she's a very special Talmidat Chachamim, scholar, and she's also a writer. She wrote some very interesting books. And this she wrote about this story. And before I read what she wrote in her passage, I'll just say, I want to paint the picture the way she reads it. Think of Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, who went really to Florida for a month or two or a year or two. The way the Talmud paints the picture, he came back and he's wearing this Hawaiian t-shirt and he doesn't have a kippah and he has flip-flops and he walks into the Bet Midrash and with long curly hair and everybody's looking at him and he can see them kind of smiling and smirking and hiding their smile under their beard, and they don't really know what to do with him, and they call him to the Torah, and he can't really even read Hebrew. That's the picture that the Talmud is painting. She paints a totally different picture. He comes in and he's with his flip-flops and long curly hair, and he doesn't even have his kippah home. He has a baseball cap. And they call him to the Torah, and he looks around, and he can perfectly read Hebrew, and he knows the exact verse, but he realizes that they think that he's lost it all. So he, instead of saying, "Hachodesh hazeh lachem," he says, "Acheresh haya libam," but in her interpretation, he's speaking to them and saying to them, listen, you've all become deaf. I know you think I'm different. I know you think I'm dressed weird. I know you think I've forgotten it all. But I want to say to you that you've remained in this Beit Midrash for the past 2 years, and you never even walked out, and you don't listen to the news, and your windows are closed, and there's a whole world happening outside. I want to point to the fact that your heart has become deaf, that you're not listening to anything anymore. And instead of a chodesh hazeh lachem, instead of renewal, the fact that you weren't willing to leave the walls of this Beit Midrash and walk outside, then you're never going to learn anything new. Now, I'll read this in her words. She relates to the fact that when all of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's disciples were asked, what is the most important thing in life? Rabbi Elazar ben Arach said, you should have a good heart. So she writes, and I'll read what she writes, and if this wasn't understood, so we'll go back and explain again. She writes, what is a heart, if not like a spring within a person that channels in new oxygen at all times? To the question, which is the right path that a man should follow, Rabbi Elazar ben Arach answered, a good heart. And on the question, which is the evil path from which man should distance himself, he answered, a bad heart. Because life is constant renewal. We change and develop constantly with each and every beat of the heart. When you finish reading this sentence, you will not be the same person you were when you began to read it. It's possible to choose a good heart and change for the better with every beat. And it's also possible, unfortunately, to choose a bad heart and waste the energy of our lives. But the most horrible path, and perhaps the path which against Rabbi Elazar ben Arach tried to alert his fellow sages, is to have a deaf heart. To have a deaf heart is to have it beat without excitement, to read verses without delving into their meaning, and to bless each new month without ever changing oneself. To have a deaf heart is to let one's heart become just another organ that moves blood from here to there. It is to neglect the Torah, to neglect the Torah such that it becomes just a pile of halachic questions that need to be answered without being resolved from within, without having delved into the depths of existence, and without having the answer stem from those depths and overcome the abyss. She goes on, and you can also read the Hebrew, those of you who are comfortable in Hebrew, because she really writes beautifully. But just what I want to share and sum up at this moment is her whole interpretation of the story is saying that in this specific passage, Halacha and Agadah don't go together. The Mishnah and the Talmud aren't saying the same thing. The Mishnah is saying, stick to your friends and they'll keep you from wringing out the towel. The Talmudic story is saying the exact opposite. If you stick to your friends too much, you're never going to grow. You're never going to learn. And if Rabbi Elazar ben Arach hadn't left the Bet Midrash, he would have become one of the sages that bless over a new month every month. HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, that's the blessing of the new month. But his heart would have lost its ability to listen, just the way their hearts, in his eyes, lost the ability to listen. So I want to stop here again for a second. And we spoke about home and community. And on both of them, trying to point out how being in our safe spot is an amazing place for renewal and for study, but how being there too much or not allowing new things inside is problematic. So I want to do one short thing with the national, but before I break for that, any questions or remarks or thoughts?
I see that Eliza Berger just shared. Eliza, do you want to share? You can unmute yourself.
I can. Hello. I was just saying, I think that there's a difference in these stories between choosing to go on a journey and choosing to be dislocated and being forced to be dislocated. That there's something about Rabbi Nahorai who chooses himself to go versus the student at the beginning who is in exile, sort of maybe not as a result of his own choice, and that's also a part that the dislocation that you consent to can help you to access deeper Torah, but when you're dislocated by external forces, maybe then you don't have that same capacity.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi
This
Berger.
yeah.
And then there was a comment earlier that I wanted to share. Oh, sorry, there's one that just came in. Oh, okay. Sorry, that was just a sound issue. And you sent me a comment earlier. Did you want to share something?
I was thinking that perhaps the conversation that you and Mika have with the new students is the response is really that you need a bit of both, that you can't learn unless there's some sense of belonging, but you still need to be out of that comfortable zone. You need to be put out of your comfort zone in order to be truly open to ideas. So it's a combination of the two.
Thank you very much. I was waiting for you to say that I am correct. I want to go back to Micha and say something on my side. I'll find someone. Maima's with me. I want to say, Rabbi Berger, it's interesting. I know there's a difference between this being dislocated if we want to, or if we choose to, or if we're being forced. I want to say that if we choose to, we're not really being dislocated. Real dislocation, in my eyes, is has to have a bit of not choosing. I mean, the benefits, I'm just thinking along the lines that you were saying, that I think a lot of the benefits of dislocation can only come if you were really dislocated. Like if I wanted to go from the kitchen to the living room, I wasn't dislocated. I'm where I want to be. That's my location. This location is kind of being hevei golelim kontora. The word galut has something of, I don't want to be here, and I'm forced to do something in a bit of a different way. Just a thought. Yeah, Rabbi West. You're muted.
Yeah, Dani, I'm loving this, but I'm wondering about how this intersects with the coronavirus crisis that we're living in now in the following way. In this paradigm, pre-coronavirus, home and exile are two very different places, right? So Elazar ben Arach is in the yeshiva, and he looks like a yeshiva bachur, and he looks like a rabbi. Then he goes to Florida, and he puts on a baseball cap, and he grows out his hair, and he wears flip-flops and shorts and a Hawaiian t-shirt. He's been in two very different places, and the question is, how do they intersect? The problem we have today is that home and exile are the same place. We're in exile from home, right? That the home that we used to have is not our home. The spiritual home we used to have is not our home. And I'm wondering how the creative tensions, which presuppose two different places, intersect with our world, where we're living in the same place, and home has become our exile. And how can we find home again?
Wow. Toda rabba. Thank you very much. I was mamash thinking along those lines, and I was going to get to the various in a second. But like, I think the words we were talking about in the beginning, batala tamid, that are always, was taken away, hold a lot of what you were saying. Because mele, if we were, like, it's enough if we were sent out of home. But being at home and not being at home is the worst. Batala tamid, like I have my tamid that's around here, but it's not the tamid that I recognize. It's not what was always there. So I want to get back to that in 1 second. I just want to speak about the national level for 2 minutes, and then I'll close off and we can open for discussion. I know it's not a good way to end with, but I want to speak about tzarat. How do you say tzarat in English? Tzarat?
Leprosy.
Leprosy. Okay. So it's a nice way to end. We're going to speak about leprosy for a second, okay? Before I read in the source sheets about leprosy, a very close friend of mine, her name is Rachel Etun, she once pointed out to me that leprosy appears according to the Torah with all the borderlines between us and the world. Leprosy in the Torah you can have in your skin, you can have in your clothes, or you can have in the walls of your home. So if I was talking today about boundaries that create some sort of safeness for us, it's interesting that leprosy can meet all those boundaries. And so we can have tzarat ha'or in our skin, tzarat ha'beged in our clothes, or tzarat ha'bayit in the walls between us and the world. She went on to explain that somebody told her once, a skin doctor, I hope there's no skin doctors in the crowd, or if there are, I hope that what I'm saying is correct. So she said that a lot of skin diseases have to do with the fact that we're either filtering too much or too little. That we're either letting in too much or we're not breathing enough. And her whole Dvar Torah, her whole session was built upon that the different parts of leprosy have to do with, are we letting in too much or not letting in enough? Like leprosy in the sages world is connected many times to lashon hara, to speaking not nicely about someone. That I was willing to hear gossip about my neighbor. So that's like, I let in something that I shouldn't have let in. I should have pushed it out, and I let in something which I couldn't. There's a different, like, very cute story about leprosy in our homes, that it's not letting in enough. There's a story about, like, if you come to your neighbor and say, hey, can I have milk? And they say, no, sorry, we don't have any milk. Can I borrow a hammer? No, I don't have a hammer. Can I use your lawnmower? I don't have a lawnmower. So if somebody does that all the time and you do, so the Midrash will say, so God will give leprosy in your home. When there's leprosy in the home, you have to take everything out of the house before you demolish the home. And then your neighbors are going to walk by and say, hey, you do have some milk. Or that's funny, there's a hammer. How come you said you didn't have a lawnmower? That Midrash is trying to say it's somebody who closed off his walls too much. And the short, beautiful passage that I wanted to read on the national level, and with this I want to close, is, I'll go back to the source sheet. This will be, I know we've done a lot of sources, so this will be the final one. And I'm sorry if this is a bit too much. But in the book of Leviticus, and in source number 7, it says the following, verse 34, when you enter the land of Canaan, that I give you as a possession, and I inflict, or I will inflict an eruptive plague upon the house and the land you possess. The translation misses the Hebrew. I'll read the Hebrew for a second. Ki tavo el eretz Canaan, asher ani noten lachem le'achuza, v'natati nega tzarat bebet eretz achuzatchem. The Hebrew uses the same word, noten, which means to give. It means, by the way, to give a present. Noten is always positive. Comes from the word matana. So when you come to the land that I give you as a present, the present I will give you is leprosy. V'natati nega tzarat bebet eretz achuzatchem. What made all the commentators think about this verse is the word natati. I will give you the land of Canaan, and I will give you leprosy. Two wonderful presents, okay? The land of Israel and leprosy. So one of the interesting answers in the Midrash, this is in source number 8, says the following. I won't read it inside, I'll just explain. What is the present of leprosy? When we were fighting over the land with the Canaanites, when we were about to capture the land, they realized we were going to win. They took all their treasures and they hid it in the walls of their houses. So what will be the present of leprosy? When we inhabit the houses and they have leprosy, we'll break down the walls and we'll find the treasures. That's a cute midrash or a difficult midrash. I want to say something that I feel it's really trying to say. That the problem of moving into a home of your own is you might build walls around you that will be too thick. The present that God promises the people of Israel when they move into a land of their own is that once in a while they'll have to break their walls down. When I speak to couples that are about to get married, I speak a lot about their house they're going to build. And sometimes I say to them, don't forget your friends that are out there. It's wonderful that you're building a house of your own or a home of your own, but there's still a world. And I wish you build a beautiful home, but I hope that it has a door that can open from time to time. And there's friends out there that might still need you, either for marriage or for different. So when we enter the land of Israel, God is saying, don't close the door, don't shut the window. I want you to still care about the world. There's other nations there that need to still be cared about. There's other people in the world that are in need. And if you've been traveling the world for 2,000 years and you finally have a national home of your own, don't say, okay, I don't care about other nations or other people because we finally have a home of our own. If you do, I'll help you break a wall down every time to time so that you remember that there's other people out there. So even on a national level, a national home is a wonderful thing. But God's promise to us is not to allow us to fall into the malkodet, into the trap, into being trapped into the wonderful home that we've built and forget that there's things that are happening outside this home. Those are basically the three levels that I wanted to discuss. And regarding Rabbi Wes's question about connecting it to these times, I want to do one more shift, but I'm going to wait with that for 1 second and then try and not make the connection, but give my personal connection or my personal feeling about this sense of being at home and not being at home and what we've all been going through for the past few months with a short story from Rabbi Nachman. But I'll go to the chat because I saw somebody wrote up something. Jordana Amsel, you wrote Rabbi Berger's comment. Thank you. You know what? I'll just say something about the journey and then I'll open up for discussion because Rabbi Berger, you used the term journey, which I love. I love the word in English and I love the word in Hebrew, Masa. It's our next parsha, by the way, Parashat Mas'eh. We're always on a journey. And I want to bring a short story about a journey that I'm sure, or at least 50% of the people in the room are familiar with. It's a short story that Rabbi Nachman brings. Although he didn't make it up, he stole it from somebody else. When you grow up, you realize that many of Rabbi Nachman's stories he took from other sources. What can you do? He always has a very nice Rabbi Nachman twist to it, which is nice. So I'm going to go to his famous journey story. And through it, I want to think a bit about our times. I think it's almost the last source on the source sheet. And I'm going to skip a bit. Here, it's one of his parables. It's called The Treasure. And it's in source number 10. And we'll just read it together. And again, it might be familiar to many. A man once dreamed that there was a great treasure under a bridge in Vienna. He traveled to Vienna and stood near the bridge, trying to figure out what to do. He did not dare search for the treasure by day because of the many people who were there. An officer passed by and asked, "What are you doing?" "Standing here and contemplating." The man decided it would be best to tell the whole story and ask for help, hoping that the officer would share the treasure with him. He told the officer the entire story. The officer replied, "A Jew is concerned only with dreams. I also had a dream, and I also saw a treasure. It was in a small house under a cellar." In relating his dream, the officer accurately described the man's city and house. The man rushed home, dug under his cellar, and found the treasure. He said, "Now I know that I had the treasure all along, but in order to find it, I had to travel to Vienna." I'm going to stop sharing for a second. And I was going to do a poll, but I won't do the poll now. I'll just stop sharing. Just raise your hand if you're familiar with the story. Okay. I'm sure many of you have heard it. I think I was 10 years old when I heard it the first time. I was in the youth group, and the woman in charge of us, the counselor, she walked into the room. She took a ring off her finger and asked us to close our eyes. Said she was going to hide it in the room. We closed our eyes. She put it on her finger, and she had us searching for the ring for about half an hour. That's been it. Wasn't too nice. It was my sister, by the way. She was the one in charge. And then she told us this little Rabbi Nachman story. And the moral of the little half hour is we don't have to go far to search for things because they're all very close. And 30 years later, or 35 years later, I want to tell her, hey, Lana, you missed the point of the story. It's not what Rabbi Nachman is saying. It's true, he stole a story because about 100 years before him, this story was told in Prague with the Karl Bridge there and many bridges across Europe. But he doesn't say, don't go to Prague. You have a treasure at home. He says there's a wonderful treasure at home, but you're never going to find it unless you travel to Prague or to Vienna, or unless you're willing to go on the journey. Now, what's beautiful with Rabbi Nachman, and this will be my final sentence connecting to today, and I'm opening up for any comment. Rabbi Nachman goes on with this story. These are the other sources that I brought in a different book called Likutei Moharan, which are things that he taught. And he speaks about the whole world of lost and found. And he says we've all lost something in the world. And we're all looking for what we lost. And we find them bit by bit throughout our life. The way we find them is that we meet people that have also lost something. They're searching for what they're lost. Sometimes they've found theirs and they keep searching. And if we find someone, they might have found something that belongs to us. And the whole world is a big lost and found. And he translates this whole idea of journey to finding things that we had once and that we've lost. And when I was thinking, when you were talking earlier, Rabbi West, about home and not being at home, and the balance that Anne was mentioning before, about what do we need to do to grow? As I was saying to Rabbi Berger earlier, I feel that unfortunately, you can't choose exile, or we can't choose dislocation. It always has to come with discomfort. And I don't want to romanticize Corona, because I hear that a lot. And it's true, we might have learned many wonderful things, but it's something terrible which is going on. It's terrible in its consequences for many people and for communities and for financial aspects in many, many ways. What it does bring to mind for me in many, many ways is the balance between being at home and having my home shaken for a while. In many ways, being at home and traveling to Vienna and to Prague at the same time. And on every level of our existence, our home, our community, our larger community, I wanted to think of what that does to us. Like, what will high holidays that look different than what we've grown up with for the last 50 or 60 years? What would that do to me if I hear Kol Nidrei differently? If I'm not sitting next to the person that I'm used to sitting in shul? Besides it being very difficult, what does it do? And I don't know good or bad. I wanted to put it out. I wanted to think of that movement in our hearts, in our minds. So I'll stop for a second and open up for any remarks or questions or Ken.
I think Rabbi Robinson had a comment as well.
Okay. Simcha.
Make sure that. Okay, you should be unmuted.
Oh, you have since transcended even what you were saying before, but I was really resonating with the piece from Rabbi Nachman about each of us having lost something, and the flip of that story was so beautiful, because I too have always understood it as you always had what you had at home. And it made me think about a beautiful poem that was written by Lawrence Kushner. I don't know if you've heard it. I sent you the link to it, about each of us being a piece of a jigsaw puzzle, and that we each have something that we need to be presenting with each other. And we have to engage on that journey in order for others to be able to discover that missing piece in themselves, and for us to be able to discover that missing piece with others. So I don't know if you've seen the poem, but I wanted to share it with you.
Well, not yet, but thank you. I see now, so thank you very much. I want to share something else, Michelle, because I'll look at the poem in a second. It's interesting that in the Torah, you retrieve lost property and you return it to the person who lost it because you're part of a community. The verses that I didn't read use the word achicha, your brother, your sister. We help them because they're part of our community. In a different shiur, I was studying, there's an Israeli sociologist called Dani, and he writes about something that many of you might be familiar with, the ethics of caring. And he does a flip and says, we become a community because we've all lost something. I'll just say that again. It's not that we retrieve lost property to people because we're part of a community. What makes us feel close to each other, and that's part of the ethics of caring, is that we're aware of the fact that we can lose something if everybody around us has lost something, that brings us together. So Stam, I was thinking in relation to what you were saying over there.
And yeah, we have a comment from Jeff Faust.
Yeah.
Jeff, are you there?
Just saying before, after Lisa Berger, shared her issue about, and you commented about, it makes a difference if you choose to go on a journey or if you're forced to. And I'm saying sometimes there's a combination, and thinking about the first aliyot, from the 1800s and early 1900s to Israel, were a combination, because we had the big pogroms after 1881 and political Zionism, but it was still a choice, but it was partially a necessity too.
I think that many times they go together. I want to say one more word, just kind of personally. I feel a bit heavy with my summing up, and I want to say where this meets me. Maybe one last personal word of hope. Not just home and feeling at home, but a word of hope. I mentioned that I like to prepare all my shiurim and to be very much on the page in every source. And I must say that the classes that I really enjoyed best were the ones that forced me to move. I didn't choose them. I was very uneasy when I was asked a question that I didn't know. I do find, for me personally, dafka, in spite of the fact of me being so home-oriented and feeling at home and not extending my limits, is that sometimes I think Micha is right. I didn't want to admit this at the end of the class, but sometimes I think he's right. And part of my hope being away from home is that there's a lot of things here that I wouldn't choose. But I feel that in many ways, for personal people, for society, for the questions it's making us relook at or revisit, and for the things that we put aside and didn't look at for a while, there's great potential for this uneasiness causing us to move, hopefully in very positive ways, in every one of the circles that I was talking about. The personal, the communal, the national. So, so I really want to say Toda Rabba. It's really a pleasure. Thank you, Rabbi West. Thank you, all the rabbis in the community. I don't know all the names, but Toda Rabba. Thank you, Amy. And mamash, it's a pleasure being with you. Toda Rabba.
Thank you, Dani. We will see you all next Tuesday at 10 a.m. with you, Kurtzer, and I'll be sharing the recording from this session. Have a good day, everyone.